Oh, thank God. I got it to work. I've been tied up down here all week with only water, no communication with the outside. For all I know, no one's noticed I'm missing. But there's a bright spot because I was somehow able to get hold of my laptop. So I'm gonna use the precious few moments I have with you, possibly my last, to give a lukewarm defense of the middling horror writer Bentley Little. So I've been noticing more criticism lately of an author that I have a lot of love for, Bentley Little. Granted, criticism of Little's work has been around probably since he published his first novel, so this isn't a new phenomenon, just one I've noticed more, and one I myself have admittedly contributed to with my review of The Burning. Now, I stand by everything that I said in that review, and stand by that book is horrible. But I do think that Bentley Little, as a writer, has a lot of redeeming qualities, and is a writer who brings something unique to the horror genre. I've previously stated that I think his novels are pretty hit or miss, but I think his talent really shines in the short form. So, over the next two videos, I will be discussing probably his two best known short stories, The Mailman and The Washingtonians, in an attempt to provide a lukewarm defense for Little as a writer. But before we do that, I'm going to give a brief history of my experience with Bentley Little so that you know where I'm coming from. In my first ever video, I mentioned that The Dark Half by Stephen King is the book that got me into horror, and really into reading more generally. But what I didn't mention is that I fell off of King with the next book that I read, Cell. I would eventually return to him, but there were a few years early on in my development as a horror enthusiast that I avoided his work. So I went in search of other authors. I discovered the work of Peter Straub, Shirley Jackson, and William Peter Blatty, among others. I also began subscribing to a few different literary horror magazines, one of which was Cemetery Dance. And the third issue of that subscription that I received was the Bentley Little special issue, which contained two short stories, an interview, and a retrospective of his career. So I was introduced to Bentley Little through his short stories. From here, I read three of his novels, The Ignored, The Walking, and The Store, as well as his short story collection, The Collection, and remember enjoying all of them, to varying degrees, obviously, but still finding them all entertaining at the very least. In that time, Little became a writer who I'd buy books of purely because of the author's name. I fell off of horror and genre fiction more generally in college, but this year, possibly because of COVID or possibly because of the stress of grad school, most likely both, I longed to return to my old comfort blanket. And the author that immediately came to mind as a reintroduction to horror was Bentley Little. Now, that obviously didn't go as well as it could have, and The Burning had pretty much as many flaws as a book can have. However, I will say this for it. Despite me not liking the book, I did finish it. Not only that, I finished it quicker than I normally finish books of that length. And I'll tell you why that was the case. Because even when Bentley Little's work is bad, and he's written a few stinkers, you're still pretty much guaranteed a wild ride that only he can produce. And with that, let's discuss the first of our two stories. The Mailman was originally published in 1988 in the summer edition of The Horror Show and was later included in The Collection. I don't believe there was any alterations to the story beyond a short author introduction when it was collected, but for the sake of clarity, I will point out that for this review, I read the version in The Collection. This short story was also later expanded by Little into the novel of the same name, which was published in 1991. Before we get to the story itself, I need to give a content warning. This story does discuss people with dwarfism in not the most flattering ways. So if you don't want to deal with that, skip this one and watch the Washingtonians review next week instead. Lastly, this story is 14 pages long. It's impossible to discuss any work of that length in depth without spoiling it, so if you care about spoilers, there will be spoilers. The Mailman is a simple story about a man who is scared of his mailman. That's it. Don't you love it when the title basically summarizes the work for you? Well, that's a bit misleading because the reason the main character, Jack, is scared of the mailman isn't because he's a mailman, it's because he's a dwarf, to use the terminology of the story. And from there, events unfold. The tension builds up very gradually. Jack, admittedly, starts off the story pretty paranoid, but that makes his breakdown all the more believable. He is already moving in that direction, and the events of the story simply made it move faster. It also sows the seeds of doubt as to whether or not the dwarf is real or simply a figment of his imagination. For context, when he was a child, Jack is harassed by a dwarf at a carnival, very aggressively asking him to play a game he was running, at least how Jack recalls it. After this, all of the encounters with the dwarf that Jack recollects are during periods in his life that would have been high stress, and thus are more likely to trigger an episode. The particular situations discussed are when he was a POW in Vietnam, when he arrived home following the war, and in the case of the present situation, when he's just moved to a new town and about to start a new job. It's important to also note that the dwarf is described as looking different in all of these scenarios, making the reader doubt Jack even more. It also makes it so that this could potentially be viewed as a story about prejudice, since he views all people with dwarfism as the same. The first line of the story is literally, "If Jack had known that the mailman was a dwarf, he never would have moved into the house." Though, if we wanted to go down that road, it's worth mentioning The Mailman is an imperfect story about prejudice, as Little doesn't really humanize people with dwarfism at all. In fact, similar to his treatment of Chinese people in The Burning, I'd say he actually dehumanizes them, and that, I would say, is the major flaw of the story and why I would hesitate recommending it. It's things like that which are why the series is a lukewarm defense, rather than an outright defense of Little's work. Overall, though, I do think this story does a good job of building up tension, making you fear for the main character, and making you question what is real and what is imagined. Believe it or not, this is a relatively grounded story for him, and with it, he's able to show he does have some real chops. That's all for this week. Like, comment, subscribe, and join me next time for the exciting conclusion of the series, where I'll be getting political by discussing the Washingtonians. I'm Will, and this has been Will to Read. Let's see if I can still edit this with my hands tied up.